Thank you, thank you. Great. Well, Fabrizio, thank you very much indeed for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak to you today. It's really a very great pleasure to do so. What I want to say is that business is going through a period of transformative change, the sort of change that one observes every 60 or so years. And the reason for that is that, of course, we recognize that business is one of the most important institutions in our lives. It clothes, feeds, and houses us, it employs us, and it invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity, the alleviation of poverty, and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of growing environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. And every year for the past 40 years, Ipso Mori, the market research company, has undertaken a survey of 1,000 people in Britain on which professions people trust to tell the truth. At the top, or near the top, I'm pleased to say, come university professors. They may not have much power, pay, or prestige, but at least people trust us to do nothing, earn nothing, and take no credit for it. At the other end of the spectrum, you'll see from this slide, come business leaders, just ahead of advertising executives, professional footballers who are not on this list, but were at some stage, the media, journalists, and rock bottom come, of course, politicians. Business leaders actually come below bankers, below trade union officials, below the man and woman in the street. And it's been like this for many of the 40 years of the survey. Mistrust in business is profound, pervasive, and persistent. And if you look at this slide, which is based on the barometer that Edelman Trust produce, you can see that there's a marked variation in trust in business across countries. The UK, as you can see, happens to be virtually at the bottom. But what I find particularly striking about this slide is that trust in business is particularly low in developed countries as a whole, the US, European countries. And the countries where businesses are trusted more are actually the developing and emerging countries. Now, you might have lots of reasons and explanations for it, which we could discuss. But one other element that the Edelman Trust Barometer brings out is that although trust in business per se is low, people tend to trust their employers more. So you might not trust business leaders in general, but you do seem to trust your employer to a reasonable extent. And there are marked variations in the degree of trust that people have in business, depending on the nature of business, and in particular, the ownership of business. And as this slide brings out, trust in family businesses is greater than that in either other types of private firms, such as private equity firms, more so than in state-owned enterprises, and in particular, more so than in publicly listed companies. So why is it that trust in business is so low? The answer is the fuel that lies at the heart of business, the fuel that resources and sources business and incentivizes business, namely profit. Profit is the essential driver of business and capitalism. Without profit, there is no capital in capitalism. But we've misconceived the nature of what a profit is. Profit derives from the Latin proficere profectus, to advance and progress. And that is precisely what should determine profit. And sometimes it does, but too often it doesn't. It doesn't come from advancement and progress, but from advantage and regress. And to understand why that's the case, we have to look underneath the bonnet of capitalism and see what that driver is. And what this slide shows is that, of course, the way in which we measure the profit of a business is as the difference between the revenue and the costs of the business. The employment costs, the labor costs, the material costs, the capital costs. The difference between the revenue and the income and those costs is the measured profit. But that's, of course, not the profit of a business, because it doesn't take account of the extent to which a business is paying its employees below a living wage, the extent to which it's paying people in its supply chain below a fair price. It's not taking account of the degree to which a business is polluting the environment, destroying biodiversity, emitting global warming gases. And in particular, it does not account for the failure of businesses to incur the costs of avoiding those detriments, or where they do cause those detriments, cleaning up the mess that they're creating. In other words, it does not account for the true costs of the business. And when you do account for the true costs, as you can see, that level of profit which I describe here as being the just or fair profit is lower than the measured profit. And indeed, when the board of a company signs off the accounts as being a true and fair representation of the financial position of that company, they're doing no such thing. It's neither true nor fair. It's not true because it doesn't include the true cost of the business, and it's not fair because it's not therefore measuring a fair or just profit. Now, of course, this isn't just a problem of an overstatement of companies' profits. It's also a problem about an understatement, because companies cannot always earn the revenues of the good things that they're doing, the extent to which they are investing in training their employees, or the degree to which they're supporting their communities or improving the environment. They can't always capture or capitalize on those benefits that they're conferring. But there's a difference between the overstatement and the understatement, because companies can incur the costs of avoiding the detriments and cleaning up the mess, but they can't simply magically conjure up revenue streams. They have to find innovative ways of being able to do that. Now, of course, we recognize this, and we describe this as being a problem of externalities, external to the firm. But my point is that it's not external to the firm. It's absolutely intrinsic to the way in which a business operates and what motivates a business. And we should recognize it as being internal and intrinsic, not external and extrinsic. And because we are misdiagnosing the nature of the problem, we're misprescribing the right solutions. We believe it's a problem of market failures, of competition, of regulation, of taxation, of government policy in general. But those policies fail because we have not diagnosed the right problem. Competition fails because good firms that are incurring their true costs and earning a just or a fair profit cannot compete against those firms that are not and earning a measured profit. So capital flows from good firms to bad firms. And there is, from competition, a run to the bottom instead of a run to the top. It's in essence a Gresham law by which bad firms drive out good firms because good firms cannot compete in earning the same levels of return on their capital as bad firms. And regulation fails. Regulation fails because companies employ consultants and do whatever they can to avoid regulation and, if possible, turn it to their competitive advantage. And we see that going on all of the time. But more seriously, regulation fails because it's controversial. Of course, we're outraged when we discover in the financial crisis that financial institutions have been profiting at our expense. And in Britain, we've been outraged by the fact that water companies have been profiting and paying their executives handsomely while they've been dumping raw, untreated sewage into our rivers, lakes, and seashores. We're outraged by this type of conduct. And there's consensus about that outrage, but there is no consensus about what to do about it. On the political left, we have the socialists who say we need more regulation and tougher and greater enforcement of that regulation. On the libertarian right, we have those who say, no, 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 that violates our freedom and our liberties, and it undermines jobs, investment, and growth. This is a source of the polarization of our societies and the level of argument that we see going on at the moment. And we're not going to solve the problem until we recognize what its true source is, and that what is required, instead of just looking at companies that are what I'm terming here, wading through the weeds of entanglement, exploitation, and unjust enrichment, we should be looking to surf the waves of what I term here innovation, inspiration, and innovation. We should be elevating our aspirations and expectations of what we expect of business and look to it to find innovative ways of profiting from solving, not creating problems for others. Now, when you do this, two remarkable things happen. First of all, instead of being a run to the bottom, markets and competition create a run to the top, because firms that are able to internalize and find ways of innovating to earn this just profit increment outcompete for firms that do not do that. In other words, good firms are driven out by better firms. And still more strikingly, this provides a way in which there is cooperation, not conflict, between government and business. Too often there is conflict between government and business because on the one hand, government has an interest in promoting the public and social interests, and on the other hand, business is interested in profit. But when that profit comes from solving, not causing problems, then there's a natural alliance that takes place between business and government. And government can assist business in promoting its objectives because it recognizes that in doing so, it is helping government to solve public and social and environmental problems. And likewise, there's an interest of the charitable and not-for-profit sector in supporting what business is doing because their interests are aligned as well. Now, the key issue is, of course, what does it take to do this? And the answer is the fundamental reason why a business exists, why it's created, and its reason for being, namely its purpose. Purpose is a very fundamental concept for a business. And of course, the way in which we currently think about the purpose of a business and the way in which we teach it in business schools like this is based on the principle that was put forward 60 years ago by Milton Friedman in terms of its Friedman doctrine, that there is one purpose of business: to make money, full stop. Now, he wasn't wrong about that, but he simply didn't recognize that what is critical in that statement is, where is that money derived from? How does a business earn that profit? And if that profit comes from solving, not creating problems for others, then it's all to the good. But if it doesn't, it isn't for the good, and it creates serious detriments and harms, not least to the functioning of competitive markets. And to address this, we then need to appreciate what really is the purpose of a business. And the notion of a purpose that I put forward is that business is there to help us solve problems, to help you and I solve the problems we face as individuals, communities, societies, and the natural world. But it has to do it in a particular form, because it's not about charity or philanthropy. It's about hard-nosed business. It has to do it in a way that is profitable and commercially viable to do so. So the purpose of a business is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet. But furthermore, they have to make sure that in profiting, they are not producing problems for others. In other words, the purpose of a business is to produce profitable solutions for people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. And if you recognize that as the purpose of a business, then a profit automatically becomes something that derives from solving, not creating problems for others. And key to this is to recognize that that purpose is not something that is extrinsically imposed by regulation or taxation. It has to be inherent to the way in which a company sees itself as running its business. In other words, it has to be intrinsic to the way in which the business is owned, governed, measures its performance, finances itself, etc. And it has to be a central part of the way in which we look at corporate and company law around the world. Now, what I want to do is to turn now to thinking about this in the context of the subject of this conference, and that is inequality. And to think about what this tells us about addressing issues of inequality and how business contributes to the problem and how business can solve the problem. First of all, in terms of contributing to the problem, there are obvious things that if companies pay people below living wages or pay people in their supply chains below a fair trade price, they are exacerbating inequality in the world. But there's also other ways in which internally businesses create inequality through the disparity of incomes and pay between those at the top of the organization, the chief executive, and those at the bottom on the shop floor. But even more seriously than that sort of income inequality created by companies is the problem of inequality of wealth that companies create, which in many ways is an even greater source of inequality because of the difference between the value of the shares held by the owners and founders and controllers of companies and the value that the rest of us as communities and employees in companies have. But in addition, of course, a way in which business causes inequality is when it stops employment, lays people off. And of course, we're becoming increasingly concerned about the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on ending people's employment and creating unemployment as a consequence. And of course, perhaps one of the most significant aspects of the way in which companies exacerbate problems of inequality is by the way in which they produce and sell goods and in particular price them. And the extent to which necessities in the form of food, housing, energy, clothing, the extent to which those necessities in life are unaffordable to the poorest communities in countries and around the world. So business can be a major source of a cause of inequality. And it's important to note that straightforward government policy doesn't easily address, by any means, all of these problems. It may be possible to regulate around companies having to pay a living wage or indeed pay fair trade prices to people in their supply chains, but it's difficult for governments to deal with levels of inequality within firms or wealth inequalities. It's difficult for them to deal with the issues associated with unemployment that might arise from technological innovations like artificial intelligence. So we have to look to business as a mechanism of helping to solve these problems. And indeed, business can go further, not just in reversing the sorts of problems that I've just been describing, but really contributing to the well-being of people across society and not just those at the top of society. And that means thinking about not just the extent to which companies pay people reasonably well, but the extent to which they're contributing to social welfare through housing, through care, through communities. And not just in a formal sense of building houses and providing forms of care, for example, to the elderly, but also in terms of the attitude of companies to their employees. Some of the best companies in the world are those that provide housing for their employees, those that really have a sense of care for people with whom they're interacting in terms of both their supply chains and their customers and their communities. Those are the companies that display the most impressive forms of conduct in the corporate world. And this notion of community is a particularly important one. Building a sense of community, which involves thinking about, for example, the environment that companies are creating, the urban and rural environment, the extent to which they are promoting natural capital alongside built houses and factories. And it's through job creation, of course, that companies help to alleviate problems of inequality, but not just in terms of jobs that they create, but the nature of the jobs that they create. In training, in educating, in providing skills that create the capabilities of individuals to be able to really develop their full potential during their lifetime. And perhaps the most substantial way in which business has really contributed and should contribute to improving levels of equality and access around the world is through production, through mass production. One of the most significant developments in this area was, of course, Henry Ford's Model T, which introduced the notion of mass production into cars. And we've seen the same happening in terms of access to communications through mass production of phones, through access to information through computers, and access to forms of entertainment and enjoyment that comes through being able to distribute films and music and sports to people around the world. And it's vitally important to realize that what we are then talking about is not just thinking about public policy in the form of ex post redistribution from the best off in society, those with the highest incomes and the highest levels of wealth, to the worst off in society. Because this is about solving problems of inequality as they occur, as they are being made, as companies are creating in them the processes of their production in terms of how they treat people in their firms and in their supply chains, and how they then affect people in terms of the products and services that they produce for others. So we have to think about inequality in the round, not just in terms of a public policy ex post redistribution, but an ex ante activity that business is involved in and contributing towards achieving. Now, I want to illustrate this in relation to a particular example. An example which I think is very pertinent to this discussion around inequality. It's an example of a Danish company called Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk is a company that makes insulin. Insulin is used in the treatment of diabetes. And for many years, Novo Nordisk thought that its purpose was simply to produce insulin and sell it at as high a price and profit as possible. But then it realized that there is a problem with this, because 80% of type 2 diabetes is found in low and middle income countries, many of which could not afford its insulin. So it recognized that there was a problem of inequality, and a serious problem of inequality that it was causing, and that it needed to address it. And so it began to think again about what its purpose was. And it concluded that its purpose was actually to help people treat type 2 diabetes, which might involve them taking insulin, but frequently did not. So it started working with hospitals, doctors, and universities around the world to identify alternative ways of treating type 2 diabetes, which might not involve using insulin. And then it realized that its purpose was even more than that, to help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. So it started working with governments, local authorities, and health workers around the world to identify the ways in which people could avoid getting type 2 diabetes through changing their nutrition. And its stated purpose now is basically to defeat diabetes around the world. Now you might say, well, that's all very well and all very noble, but doesn't it undermine Novo Nordisk's basic model of producing insulin and selling it at a profit? And the answer is no. Its business has boomed on the back of it. It's boomed because in the process of building those relations with governments, with health workers, with hospitals, with universities, it has established relations of trust by which it becomes a trusted provider of advice and products for a variety of illnesses around the world. Now, there are three important lessons that come out of this. The first one is the importance of having a clarity of what problem a company is there to solve. Second, no company on its own can solve major problems by itself. It has to work in partnership with others. In this case, Novo Nordisk was working with not-for-profit organizations, with doctors, hospitals, universities, and with governments and local authorities around the world. And thirdly, it brings out the point that if a company can do this, it creates the most valuable asset that a company can have. And that is to be trusted, to be seen to be trustworthy, worthy of our trust. Now, many of you will know that this has served Novo Nordisk extremely well, because in the process of trying to find alternative ways of helping people treat type 2 diabetes, it realized that, of course, a key aspect of that was weight. And so it stumbled across another drug called Wegovy, a weight-losing drug which has become a blockbuster for Novo Nordisk. But this also brings out the problems and risks of success that companies can face, because this has posed a real issue for Novo Nordisk, the first of which is that because Wegovy is such a valuable asset for Novo Nordisk, which has propelled Novo Nordisk to being the largest company by stock market value of any company in Europe, taking that spot from LVMH over the last year, that from that success has come a real issue. First of all, it's encouraged the company to switch production from insulin to the production of a weight-treating drug, causing problems of supply of insulin. Secondly, this is actually a drug that's quite expensive. So it's raising questions about exactly the starting point. ensuring affordability and real equal access to products of people around the world. And thirdly, of course, there are issues that people are increasingly recognizing that there may be adverse side effects with these drugs. So this illustrates the notion that in solving problems, companies create problems. And they have to find ways of solving those problems they've created. So that a problem-solving purpose is not just an action, it's a process. It's a repeated process of solving some problems, creating other problems, solving those problems, and advancing and progressing. And that should be the source of the value creation, not just solving a problem and creating another problem. And let me just finally end by telling you a little bit about how, in practice, this can and should be implemented by businesses. We've been working with the boards of companies of some of the largest European, North American, and other companies around the world and financial institutions to help those boards implement a real problem-solving purpose in their businesses. And we've developed a framework which we call the SCORE framework, where the 5 letters of SCORE are an acronym for the key components. The first letter, S, is to simplify the corporate purpose exactly along the lines of the way in which I was saying that Novo Nordisk simplified and clarified its purpose around defeating diabetes. The second letter, C, is for connect. To connect that corporate purpose to the company's strategy. So it's not just something that's done on the side, it's not promotional marketing, it's not corporate social responsibility, it's not even ESG. It is the driver of a company's business. It's the overarching framework within which the strategy resides. But it's also C for connect in the sense of connecting the company to all the other parties with which the company has to work to be able to solve those problems and internalize and capitalize on the benefits that it's creating. In particular, as I was saying, with the public sector and with government, as well as the not-for-profit sector. The third letter is for ownership. The formal ownership of the company in terms of who are the shareholders. Novo Nordisk is listed and traded on the Danish and the New York stock markets, and that's why it's one of the most active, one of the largest valued companies in the world now. But it has a dominant shareholder in the form of the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Steen Thompson will talk in a moment about foundations in much greater depth. But that foundation has given a sense of purpose and a commitment to that purpose, which is absolutely critical for a company to be able to deliver on its purpose. But it's not just for ownership in the sense of the formal ownership of the firm, but ownership in the sense of everybody in the organization, from the board to the shop floor, has to perceive their part in the purpose of the business. They have to understand what their ownership of the purpose is. It's just like when J.F. Kennedy went round NASA and asked a janitor there, and so what do you do here? Janitor responded by saying, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. It's a sense of real ownership of the purpose and an understanding of what their role is in delivering on that company purpose. The culture and the values of an organization are critical to that, but so too is the reward structure, which is what the R stands for, the remuneration, the incentives, the promotion of people in business, so that people feel that the business is really walking the talk. And to do this, one has to be able to measure the performance of the company in terms of delivering on its performance and ensure that the company has the metrics to determine where it is solving problems and where it's creating problems. Because from the point of view of people in the organization, they really need to feel that there is a commitment from the top management to delivering on the company's purpose. And the final letter, E, is to exemplify, to bring this alive, to create a sense of shared purpose from everyone who's involved in it. Everyone, not just in the organization, but those in the supply chain, those in the community, so that there's a sense of a common purpose around shared prosperity. That's what really motivates people, and that's why this notion of equality and avoidance of inequality is such a crucial element. We talk a great deal about the role of purpose in terms of addressing climate change. What we're increasingly realizing is that this social element, in terms of being able to embrace all on whom the company is impacting and ensuring that the company is not profiting from creating problems for them, that becomes a key part of the success of business. And what has really given people a sense of understanding of what a purpose is this realization that the notion of creating value from solving, not causing problems for others, is really the determinant of the success of a business. And that understanding of success is so important because that is what lies at the heart of corporate law. Every corporate law in the world basically says that the role of a director is to promote the success or the interest of the company. That success of the company derives not simply from profit, but from a profit that derives from solving, not creating problems for others. And that creates this most valuable asset that a company can have, to be trusted and trustworthy. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, trustworthy corporations are commercially successful corporations. And the trustworthiness of corporations is the determinant of the competitiveness of nations around the world. For the benefit of the many, not just the few, for the future as well as the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll take one burning question, and then there's more opportunity to ask questions in the panel. One burning question, or shall we move on? Go for it. Do you need a microphone, or? Do you have a microphone? It's coming. It's coming.
Yes. Thank you very much. Very interesting and inspiring. And you, in the middle of the conversation, you explained that, of course, moving from where we are right now to moving towards the idea that you're proposing is going to be the most difficult issue. And it struck me that you're highlighting, so I can imagine that there's a lot of different elements that we can think about in making changes to organizations, to society, to move in the direction that you're proposing, and that, of course, there's not one solution or one, let's say, golden pill. But what struck me in what you're describing is that you're specifically mentioning at some point that, let's say, legislation is not a solution. I think, if I hope I say that correctly, legislation is not a solution, or regulation is not a solution. But on the other hand, you specifically mentioned at the end, and also earlier, corporate law. Yeah. So while I totally understand that we need to do a lot of things, and for example, education can be one of the aspects of changing mindsets, my specific question is, why do you highlight regulation as not a good way and corporate law as a good way?
Okay, thank you for raising it, because it's absolutely central to what I'm saying. The reason why regulation as such doesn't solve the problem is it is external to the company. Okay? It's a set of rules by which companies are expected to behave. Now that's important. That's important for laying down what society expects of companies. But so long as the fundamental objective of companies is to profit, and they are under immense pressure to maximize their shareholder value because they're competing against each other, and if they don't do that, they risk having a hedge fund activist come along or a takeover, a hostile takeover. Because companies are under such pressure to do what they can to maximize their share prices, they do what they can to minimize the impact of regulation on them. And as we've seen in the case of banking, for example, they lobby intensively to water down whatever regulators and governments are putting forward. It shouldn't be like that. And indeed, it should be the case that companies recognize it's intrinsic to their success to ensure that they are benefiting from creating benefits for others, not detriments and harms. And that's where law plays such a central role, because a law defines what a company is. A company is a legal fiction. And we've designed a company in a particular way and defined it in terms of directors promoting the success of the firm. So it doesn't even need a change in legislation to bring this around. And I'm working with the commercial courts of law around the world for them to recognize that actually it's the way in which judges in commercial courts interpret the word success. What do we mean by the success of a company? My argument is it's not simply as companies making a profit, but are they making a profit in the right way? And by the right way, what I mean is by solving, not creating problems. Now, I set this out in a great deal of detail and in my book, and I think all I can do at this stage is to ask that perhaps you might read my book.
Thanks again. Wonderful. Love your passion. Thank you.